Rabbit, Redux by John Updike, book review. So this book is a sequel to Rabbit Run, also by John Updike. Rabbit Run I've reviewed separately, but just to recap it briefly. The plot of Rabbit Run is Rabbit is the name of the character. He's not a rabbit, he's a former high school basketball player. Former high school basketball star. And in the first book, Rabbit Run, he is 26, so he's now working, I forget what he's doing. He's working at a used car dealership or something like that. But he's working some sort of dead-end job, and he's married and he has a kid, and his high school glory days are behind him, and he kind of gets scared and he tries to run away from it all. That's the plot of the first book. Rabbit Redux takes place 10 years later. I think was written 10 years later. So the first book was written in 1960. This book is written in 1970. And we kind of catch up with this player, with this character 10 years later, where he's now 36 instead of 26. Still like a former high school basketball star who's adjusting to kind of real life in a dead-end job. But now it's the 60s, and so, you know, the hippies and the anti-Vietnam War protests and the civil rights movement and the black revolutionaries and all of that is in this book. So the book is kind of both a sequel to the original, and it's also kind of a timepiece about the 1960s. Now, I was born myself in 1978. But I've always been, or when I was younger, I used to be very fascinated by the 1960s. It's got an allure to it as a fascinating time period in general, and I think most people in general are kind of fascinated by the time period right before when they were born anyways. So, yeah, I was attracted to this book both because it's got kind of a reputation as being a great work of literature, and I was interested in kind of a timepiece of the 1960s. Now, John Updike had a reputation as being conservative, so it's not an overly generous view of the hippies and the black revolutionaries. I remember an English professor at college who said that he used to talk about how brave John Updike was for supporting the Vietnam War in the 1960s. Because, at that time, most of the intellectuals were against the Vietnam War. John Updike was kind of swimming against the stream by being for the Vietnam War, and my college professor was praising him for his bravery. That always used to rub me the wrong way, because I was always anti-Vietnam War myself. Now, again, I was born long after that whole thing finished, but just my opinion on the history of it, I thought that war was a mistake. So I always thought it's a mistake to praise him for being brave about it. Granted, if you're kind of going against your peer group, that does take a certain amount of bravery, but bravery is kind of one of the most overrated human virtues. There are plenty of people who have been brave on the wrong side of history, and it didn't do anybody any good. And in fact, it caused a lot of harm to be brave for the wrong cause. All that being said, though, I've been looking this up to try and fact check my university professor, and it looks like John Updike's support of the Vietnam War was overstated. I found a New York Times article when John Updike was New York Times article from their archive. So it's online, but it was published like way back when in 1969 or whatever. And in this article, John Updike was saying, to the extent I supported the Vietnam War, it was just in response to a questionnaire. So there's a questionnaire sent around to like prominent authors. What do you think about the Vietnam War? And he kind of checked or wrote in the response, I believe that the war could bring about some good or something like that. So he the impression you get from his own words is that he wasn't kind of going out of his way to advocate it. This was just in response to questionnaires that had come to him. And then in this same editorial, which was in the late 60s, he said, "I've now come to the conclusion that this war is unwinnable and it's doing more harm than good, etc., etc., etc." So he apparently came around on it. Anyways, but I think he was always kind of more conservative leaning throughout his life. So you get a portrayal of the 60s here, but the hippies and the black revolutionaries, it's not an overly sympathetic portrayal. Anyways, I'll just kind of read from the review here. So this is a sequel to Rabbit Run. I think Rabbit Redux is kind of infamous. Arguably, it's an example of a sequel that's more famous than its predecessor. It continues both the story of the troubled domestic life of Harry Angstrom. Rabbit is the nickname. Harry Angstrom is his real name. The former high school basketball star who was never really able to settle into life once he left his basketball glories behind. And it also serves as a timepiece from the 1960s. So in this next book, Rabbit ends up living in a house with Jill. Jill is the name of a teenage hippie who has run away from her rich parents, and Skeeter. Skeeter is a pseudo-black revolutionary. It's interesting reading this book. Again, it's kind of somebody who was born after this all ended. I have a tendency maybe to romanticize the past, right? To say, the 1960s, this is when life was exciting. Nowadays, young people, all they do is waste their time playing video games, but back in the 60s, people were actually going outside and having adventures and living life. It's interesting, in this book, which was published in that era by John Updike, who lived through it, so he should know, how much of the book is Rabbit just sitting there watching TV. So yes, there's all these things kind of happening in the 60s, the demonstrations and the inner city riots, but as far as Rabbit is concerned, these are all just things he views through his TV screen, which probably is how most people really experienced the 60s. It was just, you know, the news on TV. And then they just kind of spend a lot of time watching daytime TV as well. So you get the impression that Rabbit and his family are wasting just as much time in front of the couch as modern people are. The only difference was back then, you know, there was only 3 channels instead of 300. But they do seem to be kind of wasting their lives in front of the TV, even back then. Now, the changing times in this book are represented by Jill and Skeeter and kind of the new community they form in Rabbit's house. But neither Jill nor Skeeter really come alive for me as real characters in the original Rabbit story. I think it's hard for anyone to write about the 1960s. Even though this book was kind of more or less contemporary with it, it's hard to avoid writing about hippies without writing in stereotypes. It's hard to avoid writing about revolutionaries or pseudo-revolutionaries without kind of writing in stereotypes. John Updike, I think he just barely manages to avoid the trap of writing in cliches, but he's still not kind of created kind of full-fledged characters here. Jill is portrayed as a spoiled rich kid who likes to repeat revolutionary slogans she doesn't really understand. And she still expects people to clean up after her. So she was raised in a rich family where the maids cleaned up after her. She's rejected her parents' bourgeois lifestyle and has tried to run away from it. But she has never really kind of shaken this habit of having other people clean up after her. So she still hasn't learned how to clean up after herself. Skeeter, the black revolutionary, comes off as almost just as scatterbrained, plus sex-crazed and egotistical. Now, the thing about, I thought this was kind of an unsympathetic portrait of the 1960s revolutionaries. But, you know, the thing is, I'm sure these people were out there. Like, I went to some protests myself when I was younger. This was in the 1990s, not the 1960s. But I encountered a fair amount of people at these protests who were scatterbrained and kind of not fully there. So I don't doubt that these kind of people were part of the 1960s as well. But you know, the thing about it, the 1960s, is it's a whole decade. And it's got all these varieties of experiences in it. So you know, I'm sure there were intelligent student protesters, intelligent black revolutionaries, and you could tell those stories instead. So he's being kind of somewhat selective about what stories he wants to tell. But that being said, I don't think he's necessarily wrong by telling these stories. These people were probably out there as well. At the very least, Rabbit Redux is equal opportunity in the sense that it makes both sides look stupid. So even though John Updike might have had a conservative bias himself, he shows Rabbit Engstrom and his father are both kind of pro-war, but their pro-war jingoism comes off just as stupid as the anti-war slogans in the book. So he is kind of hitting both sides equally here. Also, I had a friend, I mentioned this in my review of Rabbit Run, who was convinced that John Updike had the worst sex scenes in literature. I don't know if this is because he's planted the idea in my head, but I am coming around to his idea. This book is a bit more sexually explicit than its predecessor, Rabbit Run. And I am kind of feeling here that, yeah, maybe John Updike really does write terrible sex scenes. In particular, the sexual descriptions of the teenage girl, Jill, made me feel like I was reading some sort of male fantasy about sexual teenage girls. The main character here is 36. I think John Updike himself was of a similar age when he wrote this book, kind of approaching middle age himself, or if not middle-aged. And the fact that Jill was so eager to kind of get in bed with a 36-year-old man seemed to be like more of a middle-aged man's fantasy about what teenage girls are, you know, really like, or at least made me kind of this free love hippie thing. What free love hippies are like. She just was so eager to get into bed with 36-year-old Rabbit and would not take no for an answer. I don't know. It struck me as a little bit of a middle-aged fantasy about what teenage hippies' free love would actually be like. Sorry, I'm stumbling all over my words on this one. This is actually the end. That's all I wanted to say about this.